everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Becca and today we are doing another installment of soil chats. So we haven't done one of these in a long time, but we are back with Shota from Tank's Green Stuff. So how have you been?
I've been good. Things are busy, but things are getting hot here in Tucson, so with any luck, things will slow down a little bit and we'll get a chance to get all caught up.
Yeah, I'm sure that you guys are so busy in the summertime when everybody's gardening and planting and everything else.
Well, our real busy season is like through November, August to kind of the end of May and June. And normally by the time it gets into the hundreds, things slow down a little bit.
Okay, cool. Are you doing any, because today we're going to be talking about outdoor garden soil and just like outdoor gardening. So are you doing anything at your house this year?
Yeah, well, I've got a raised bed garden that we installed back in January. And we've got some potatoes and some sunflowers, some basil, some other stuff, as well as some hemp plants that we're growing. It's just part of our, recently we had the Prop 207 here in Arizona, so you can grow cannabis now, and it's part of the product development and testing, as well as for my own knowledge. I've been growing hemp in my backyard. I just couldn't tempt myself with cannabis. Like, it's just too hard to avoid consuming something I've grown, so I've been growing hemp instead as an alternative, but it's going really well and they're getting really big right now.
Awesome. That's so cool that you guys can grow that now. I love it. That's really cool. I asked you guys on Instagram what questions you had about soil, garden soil really, because I have no idea what I'm doing in the garden at this point. I've learned a few things here and there, but since I'm so new to it, I figured that a lot of you were also new to it. So I wanted to do a soil chat with Shota to talk about garden soil because it's very, very different from houseplant soil. And if you're new here, Tank's Green Stuff is the company that I created the houseplant soil mix. So actually Shota and I created it together. So I mean, he does a lot of the work to get it out to you guys, and really, like, this is the guy. So he's yeah, holding it up there. So I don't know, I just want to give Shota a big shout out for being amazing with the with our soil mix that we've created. So if you haven't checked it out yet, it is for houseplants specifically. But so today we're going to talk about the garden, but just wanted to give you some information about who this person is if you are brand new and if you happen to know about my soil, so, or our soil, that is. So let's hit us with the first question.
The first question was about agricultural zones and whether or not they're important. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with agricultural zone or the USDA hardiness zone scale, basically every region is given a number that's based on the minimum or the maximum minimum lowest temperature. So the lowest possible temperature in that area. For example, here in Arizona, Tucson specifically, we're in a 9A to 9B area. Arizona as a whole generally ranges from about 5A to 9B. And then in Missouri, you guys are somewhere between 5B and 7B. And over by where you're at in near Columbia is about a 6A. The reason that those ratings are important, it basically determines when and what can be planted over the course of the year. So at what time something is best planted at and which plants will thrive in your area. Generally speaking, that's a pretty wide range and there are definitely a lot of exceptions to the rule. One of the things that I keep in mind is that even if you're in a 9A area or a 9B area, if you have a really shaded backyard and you've got a water feature or things like that, they're different microclimates. And so just because you're growing something on one side of town doesn't necessarily mean that that plant is going to successfully grow on the other side of town, just based on the local microclimate. Some areas get higher freeze hours than other areas during the course of the winter, or just kind of your sunlight, elevation, and water that's available there. There's so many factors that go into it. I wouldn't rely solely on a hardiness rating to decide whether or not something's going to work or whether or not you should give something a try.
It's the same with houseplants, really. I mean, we have microclimates within our house. So some plants will do really well in the sunroom and some plants will do really well in my kitchen or in the greenhouse cabinet. So think of it that way, but on a much larger scale. So you can manipulate your environment with tall trees or water features like Shota said. So that's really good to know. Okay, so the next question is, what is the best soil for starting seeds, and when to actually transfer seeds to a soil, to a nutrient-rich soil mixture?
Generally, a nice seeding mix works better. So something that's got good moisture holding capacity and has relatively low nutrients is going to be best for seeding. Mostly, you can germinate seeds in just about anything. I'm sure everyone's done the classic school experiment where you've germinated seeds in a paper towel and a Ziploc bag. So sprouting the seed isn't that hard. The seed contains all the vital nutrients inside to get to those first set of leaves to get the seed to sprout. After that, seedlings tend to be a little bit more sensitive both to nutrients, moisture, and temperature. And so using something that has relatively lower organic material or nutrient content tends to be the best way to go. But ultimately, it depends really on the type of seeds or the plants you're trying to grow. So you can either grow them inside. A lot of places, because of the growing seasons or because it gets too hot or too cold or it stays too cold for too long, a lot of people recommend doing your seeds indoors or in a growing room using something like peat moss or cocoa peat, which is our preference, is just to use a little cocoa peat and perlite. And you can find coconut coir basically anywhere. After that, you'll want to leave the seedlings in those containers until they have 2 true leaves. And so when most seedlings sprout, you'll have 2 little leaves that come up, and those are your baby leaves. There's a technical name that's escaping me right now. And then after that, you'll get 1 set and then a second set. So you have 3 leaves in total, 2 babies and 2 proper leaves. And at that point, it's a good rule of thumb that at that point you can transfer that into the garden, assuming that your outdoor temperatures are appropriate for transplanting the seedlings. And then you can also always direct sow, where you just go out to your garden and throw some seeds in the ground and let nature do what nature does. As we've discussed before in other soil chats, backyard gardening is one of the biggest overusers of fertilizer. So a lot of the potting mixes that are available in stores will have a lot of nutrients or additional fertilizer mixed in with them. So it can be a little bit harder to get seedlings started in a store-bought potting mix, where an in-ground garden or raised bed mix or something like that tends to have a little less nutrients overall. And so you can have pretty good luck just seeding directly into those environments.
Yes, it does. I actually just direct sowed like a bunch of stuff yesterday. I did a couple melons, zucchini, cucumber, some marigolds. I don't know, just to see what happens.
Yeah.
So we'll just have to see.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with going out and just throwing the seeds down, watering it, and seeing what comes up. I mean, seeds are designed to be sowed outdoors. I mean, that's where they all came from. That's where they all end up.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right, so the next question is how to mix your own garden soil. So what's needed for that? And because basically a lot of soil mixtures will come in bags. Can you just put the bags directly into the beds, or should you be mixing in something? What would you suggest?
Depends on the bags, but let's start with in-ground gardening. The general rule for in-ground gardening is you're going to do a garden plot. So you've got your ground, and depending on where you live, you may or may not have to spend a lot of time digging and disrupting the soil and incorporating the organic matter in. Here in Arizona, you kind of have to, at least the first growing season, till in the organic material. And so our general recommendation here at Tanks is to get a couple bags of compost and put down about 3 inches of compost and till in about a minimum of 6 inches. And so what it comes out to is a roughly 50-50 mix of our organic compost with the native soil. And that works really well for in-ground gardens here in Arizona. For raised bed gardens, we generally recommend a blend of, on the most cost-effective side, we recommend adding some native soil, mixing in some organic compost, adding some coconut coir. We like to use our cocoa peat and the cocoa chip in our raised garden bed soil. We also use a little bit of decomposed pine, or what might be known as like a forest mulch, and a little perlite. So those are the ingredients that we use in our raised garden bed mixes, but any combination of those works well. Big concern with just throwing bags of compost or organic material into a raised bed and planting seeds is that you don't have all the necessary ingredients for successful living soil, and the fact that you might be missing out on the mineral element of the soil. And we've talked about this before, where soil is made up of three elements, being dirt or rock or the inert material, the organic material, which is the carbon, the compost, and then the last thing is going to be the organisms, whether it's microbiology, worms, things like that make up the soil. That's where we generally don't recommend using just organic material in a raised bed garden. That also comes from the fact that our compost here at Tank's Green Stuff is super rich and has a fairly high nitrogen content and is really fine. And so we like to recommend using coconut coir and perlite at the very minimum to make sure that the soil has nice drainage, good aeration, and increased water holding capacity.
With the garden beds, you put the soil in initially 1 year, and then next year the soil is still there. So what do you need to do to prepare that soil for the following years? Because it's probably depleted, but
right.
Are you supposed to, because you're not going to remove all of it and then replace it every year.
Yeah.
So like, what do you do?
Right. The only people that really end up removing all their soil or throwing out a soil after the growing season are folks doing high value crops like cannabis, where they're worried about pests or fungal infections or things like that in the soil. So between growing seasons, we recommend that you add organic compost, and we like to add our super mix organic fertilizer to raised bed gardens between growing seasons. General rule of thumb, a garden bed is going to not only continue to break down and sink, the soil is also going to settle. As the plants grow, they're pulling nutrients out of the soil. So to replenish the organic matter that's been breaking down over the course of a growing season, and to account for the settling and for the nutrients being taken up by the plants, we generally recommend adding like an inch or two of compost as well as some of the super mix organic fertilizer to the garden bed between growing seasons. And whether you till it in or mix it in or not is up to you. But yeah, that's basically the easy way to just make sure your garden bed's ready for the next growing season. And the sooner you can do that before the next planting, the better, giving the soil time to settle in and get acquainted and get mixed together nicely.
Okay, that's helpful. Yeah, after I finished filling mine up, I was like, wait a minute, am I gonna have to do this every season? Because this sucks.
Yeah, well, hopefully,
But you don't.
You only have to add a couple bags here and there to kind of top it off every.
Yeah, okay, that's good. That's good. Okay, this question is interesting. So is there a no-dig method? Like, is that legit? Like, no-dig gardening?
No dig is, if you just Google it, it comes up as folks putting cardboard down on the ground and then putting soil on top of it, generally some kind of compost, and then planting directly into that. And then just like you would with any raised bed garden, they're adding more compost or more organic material year after year to continue building that up. Big proponents of doing a no dig garden is the fact that you don't have to dig down and that you don't have to till, and that it promotes a nice living soil. When you really just kind of break it down and look at it though, it's like a raised bed garden. Basically, you're not digging a hole and planting, you're just putting it on the ground without a frame. And so it's a legitimate way to grow. Is it unique? I mean, it's essentially the same mechanism as a raised bed garden, where you're putting soil on top of the ground and planting in it, and year after year you're going to add more organic material to account for the material that's breaking down, the nutrients that are being taken up by the plants. Benefit of them is that you're not disrupting the soil microbiology every time you're going in to incorporate material. You're simply having the existing garden, leaving the microbiology alone and not disrupting the fungal colonies, and just adding organic material on top every season between growing. Similar to no-till, and it works. And I think it's up to personal preference and what you're planting whether or not you want to try it out. But you have multiple beds, so you could, in theory, leave one no-till and see if that works for you, where you just don't dig it or till it at all between seasons.
Yeah, I don't know about that. That seems, because my beds have already kind of compacted a bit. Like I went to go plant some seeds and there was definitely like a layer on top that is like hard. And underneath it is like nice and moist, but I like had to sort of turn it over to even be able to plant seeds. So I don't know how that would go.
And that's one of the things, is we're so used to soil being so light and fluffy, and that's what we like to see and feel. But naturally, when soil dries out, that's why it's the reason it's drying and crusty or hard is because it's a blend of the soil drying out combined with the minerals in the water kind of creating a hard crust. And so one of the ways to avoid that is just making sure that the water or the soil stays nice and wet and moist, as well as just letting the roots and the seeds do their thing. Like, people are always worried about soil compaction, and they don't always realize how strong and how powerful root systems are, and how powerful even little tiny seeds can be in terms of making their own way through hard soil. So personally, I like to tossle the soil a little bit. I try not to, because I know it's not ultimately super beneficial to go and destroy all that soil microbiology. But I'm like you, I like to touch the soil, I like to break it up a little bit. I think it's good, but it's one of those misconceptions where it's not necessarily the best practice, but it works.
There is definitely something to be said about digging your hands in some fluffy, soft soil, but that makes sense.
Exactly.
I do think about that. And especially here, there's like a lot of spiders in my beds, and I leave them because they'll probably eat the nasty things that I don't want. But I'm like even less inclined to dig my hands in because I know that there's spiders living in the soil. So I'm like, I'm not going to touch it.
I never thought of spiders being in the garden. That's like something we don't see a whole lot of in Arizona. That's pretty awesome. I'm sure they do real quick work of like flies and aphids and stuff.
We'll have to see. I mean, there was like a big mom wolf spider in my one of my beds when I was planting some tomatoes. And I was like, oh, excuse me, sorry. She had like a big egg sac on her back. And I was like, sorry, like you do your thing. I'm just planting some tomatoes.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was pretty scary. I have to wear gloves. I need to remind myself to wear gloves just in case. But okay, so the next question is soils or materials to avoid putting in your garden. So maybe like a product that like everybody recommends that you think is not good, or just sure. I don't know, what not to put in.
Yeah, first and foremost, peat moss. Aside from the fact that we don't use peat moss is not a great soil amendment. A lot of people love it. It does work, but the environmental effects of using peat moss totally contradict any benefit you're getting or the world is getting out of you gardening just by using the peat moss. Like, if you're growing vegetables or gardening because you want to make the world a better place, or you want to grow and eat your own food, using peat moss is just kind of don't use peat moss. It's not sustainable. And once it dries out, it doesn't rehydrate. Especially here in Arizona, it's something that it just doesn't work as well as coconut coir. And it also breaks down over time and slowly releases toxins into the soil. So there's one product you should stay away from. It's peat moss. Use coconut coir instead. It's a lot more sustainable, being a byproduct of your coconut water and your boba juices and all that jazz. So
yeah, there's some like recent upturns of peat moss in the community. Like people are like kind of realizing that it's super unsustainable, and I think most garden mixes contain peat moss. Like, I'm pretty certain that everything that I put in my garden has peat moss. Awesome.
I mean it's just hard so hard to avoid. From. Yeah. Well, next time you put in some garden beds, let me know and we can ship out some coconut coir for you. Alrighty.
I'll have to mix my own. When I was filling those, I was just not in the place to mix my own soil. I was like, I can't do this. This is not it for me. Yeah. pH. We talked about pH in a previous soil chat about houseplants. And for houseplants, it doesn't really matter, but for vegetables and food and even like plants like hydrangea or whatever else, I hear people talk about this a lot. Like they'll plant certain things underneath pine trees because the soil is super acidic and those certain plants will do really well. So obviously soil pH is more relevant or important for outside, right?
Well, it's only more relevant or important for certain varieties of plants. So for the most part, pH is irrelevant. Unfortunately, in most parts of the world, the pH that you have in your soil and your water is what you have. And trying to amend it on a scale, even in a backyard garden, is going to prove to be costly and ineffective. You can do the best you can. My recommendation, as always, is to rely on the soil microbiology to help buffer the pH in the rhizosphere and protect the plants from the soil, and trust that nature is going to take care of the plants. There are a few plants like blueberries, for example, that really like an acidic soil and are a lot more temperamental about being productive in an acidic soil. And so aside from the few plants that won't, that require or do significantly better in a pH controlled environment like blueberries, I wouldn't worry about it too much.
Okay, fair enough. That takes a lot of pressure off of us because, I mean, it felt like a similar answer with houseplants. Like, just let the plant handle it, and maybe if you want specific results, like with a hydrangea, you can manipulate it. But for the most part, like, just leave it. Does it matter what veggies you plant together? So this is like companion planting. There's certain plants that attract certain pests, so you don't want to put a lot of that type of plant together because you're kind of just creating a feast for that pest.
Right.
So what?
Exactly.
What do you yeah.
Yeah, whether it's like a blight or a fungal pest or insect, avoid planting similar vegetables together. So like a common one are like corn and tomatoes. Don't plant them near each other. Another one are squash and potatoes. Don't plant those near each other just because they're both susceptible to the same kinds of pests or fungus. And so separating them kind of helps you protect your harvest. For the most part, there's a lot of information out there about what plants plant well together or what plants planted together provide a benefit for one or the other. The other considerations that I find are going to be easier and more important is thinking about where the sun is, how big plants are going to be, and to make sure that your tomato plant isn't going to be shading out your carrots and things like that. So kind of the space, how plants are going to be, and the sun are just as big of a concern as it is in terms of companion planting. And you can also just plant willy-nilly. You know, it's up to you. You can take the time to do the research or just enjoy it. There's nothing out there really you can't plant together for like, you know, one plant's going to kill the other plant. It's just some plants grow better together.
Right. So with houseplants, there's a few plants out there that are pretty territorial, like the Monstera deliciosa. I've heard that if you plant like another species in with the Monstera deliciosa, it'll kill it. So that's pretty crazy. But yeah, research companion planting if you're out there. Like when I was in the garden yesterday planting seeds, I was like, oh shoot, what not to plant next to cantaloupe? And that's when I learned, like, I'm not going to plant my melons or cucumbers next to the cantaloupe because, you know, I put those in 3 separate beds because I don't want, like, I think it's like aphids that really like those. So this next question is best fertilizer for the garden. So you've already mentioned the super mix, which I have right here. So for like a huge garden bed, because my beds are 8x4, so I'm gonna be putting quite a bit in there, like probably like a couple like cupfuls, just sprinkle it on. But what else would you suggest? Like maybe like worm castings or like my kitchen compost? Like what would you suggest?
Yeah, generally speaking, obviously the super mix organic fertilizer goes a long way in providing a full spectrum of nutrients. Worm castings are great. Putting just some worms in your garden is a great way to go. Helps with the soil microbiology. Things from the kitchen that you can throw directly into your garden. Eggshells are a common thing you can throw right into the garden. I like to put my coffee grounds right into the garden. A lot of other stuff takes a little bit of composting to be effective and can also attract pests into your garden. So I'd avoid stuff like orange peels, and like meats and vegetables, putting those directly in your garden. But obviously the Super Mix organic fertilizer has a whole bunch of the organic goodies, and all the ingredients that are in there can also be purchased on their own and added to the garden. Stuff like calcium, or which you also get from eggshells, like bat guano, heat treated chicken manure. You know, for the most part, you can't go wrong with any of the organic materials. Just putting in any kind of, for lack of a better term, guano or manure material into the garden, as long as it's been processed in compost, is a good way to add some organic fertilizer to your garden. Realistically speaking, I don't recommend going too heavy on the fertilizers and staying away from your liquids or synthetics. If that's your game, by all means, keep using what works for you. At the end of the day, those synthetic fertilizers are a lot more water soluble and can be easily pulled out of the garden into the soil and then contaminating your water table and your surrounding environment. I'm sure everyone's seen and heard about like algae blooms and things like that have occurred generally because of commercial agriculture. But the amount of synthetic fertilizers used in commercial agriculture per acre is like 10% of what the average gardener throws on their garden bed in their backyard. So there's no reason to go super crazy with it. Our recommendation is just to go nice and easy and go for long-term soil health, and that over the course of the growing season will provide for your garden. So if you're doing compost and the Super Mix or another organic fertilizer like that, you shouldn't have to fertilize too often. One of the things I do recommend is adding a fertilizer when you start seeing flowers in your garden. So aside from just your beginning of the season adding of organic material and nutrients, once you start seeing flowers, I go out there and sprinkle some more Super Mix on there.
That's a super good tip. Okay, so how would you actually use the compost then? Because if the plants are already there, you don't want to be tilling it up. So would you just put it on top?
So if you're adding compost or the Super Mix in the middle of the growing season, just sprinkling on top and watering it in. I like instead of following the application rate, like for the Super Mix, it's a half cup per square foot. I'll normally go out there and I'll sprinkle, maybe a quarter of a cup every other week and spread it out and allow it to water in and filter down. And I try to keep anything that I'm adding to the garden, whether it's mulch or compost, away from the base of the plants. Some plants are susceptible to rot at the base if you have too much moisture and organic material there around the base of the plant. So
that's so awesome that you can use a Super Mix like indoors and outdoors. I feel like that is so helpful if you don't want to have a ton of different products around and you just don't have the space to do that. I have the space to hold a lot of products, but I don't want a ton of products around. It's just confusing. So I showed a couple weeks ago putting on the Super Mix on my plants, and it was slower acting, but the growth came, and it's like a lot of growth. You know what I mean? So like it wasn't like a quick zap. Like I remember we talked about in our fertilizer video how synthetics are like a quick zap to the system. Like it'll push it really quickly to put out new growth. But a organic, and specifically the Super Mix, is a little bit slower, but it helps the overall and long-term health of the soil. And I can see that like so clearly in my plants, because it wasn't like fast, but I don't know. I just definitely a few weeks later, I can see so much happening. I think that you just mentioned mulch. So somebody asked, what is mulch?
Yeah.
And what can you use for mulch? Somebody actually told me that I can use like dried grass clippings for mulch, or there's like traditional mulch like wood chips. So like what's the deal?
Mulch helps to protect the soil from both the heat and the cold. It helps to hold moisture in the soil and can reduce the soil temperature, I think up to like 20%. And so, especially here in Arizona right now, we're in a heat wave. Mulch is something that I use in the garden. Mulch is also great at suppressing weeds. So covering the soil with mulch at about 2 to 3 inches can help keep weeds from growing up. And speaking of weeds, generally we recommend staying away from stuff like straw or grass clippings, just because you're going to be incorporating or introducing seeds or weed seeds into your garden bed. So grass clippings are great for mulching grass. Like, that's a great way. One of the things that a lot of people do is instead of mowing their lawn and collecting all the grass clippings, every couple of mows, they just leave them out there because grass clippings are high in nitrogen. So as they break down, they're going to provide additional nutrients for the grass or for your lawn. However, when it comes to gardening, I recommend using something like our composted fine mulch, which is a really fine pre-composted material that's high carbon, and use it to spread on top of the organic soil surface. The best way to describe it is kind of like a forest floor. So you have your soil, you have the leaves from last year that are basically composted, and then you have the leaves from this year that are on top of that, and you kind of create a forest floor level where you have the soil, the new material that's going to be providing that fresh new organic material nutrients, and then you have the material on top of that that's protecting the soil underneath it. The big thing is, like in a raised bed garden or a garden bed, you don't really want to mulch with something like big wood chips because those aren't going to break down. So after your growing season, you're going to have to rake them off and then add your compost and then do your planting. Whereas if you do something like the composted fine mulch, over the course of the growing season, it's going to continue to break down. And so by the time next year comes along, you can either just plant right into it, till it in, whatever might be your strategy, and then plant.
Okay, I was actually thinking about mulch that I could use for my garden beds. And so you would even suggest against dried grass, like after it's dried out and everything, because the seeds could still be activated.
Oh yeah.
What about using cocoa chips? I tried to research this, but it said it was like too high in some nutrients and it would be bad. But like, do you think that would be okay to use?
So anytime nutrients or a concern with coconut coir generally comes from the fact that some coconut coir is harvested and grown near the ocean, and so has a high salt content. Aside from that, coconut coir makes a superb but expensive mulch. Like, we've done some tests where we've compared the composted fine mulch to the coconut chips or the cocoa chips on top of containers. And I mean, it holds moisture for days longer than just a traditional mulch does, and works really well. And like, it's very common in like houseplants or in aesthetic horticulture environments to use coconut coir as a top dressing to help with the moisture.
I think that's all of the questions that you guys asked. So if you have any additional questions, you can leave them in the comments. Or if you just have like super hyper specific questions, you can send Shota a message on Instagram. Their Instagram is, what's your Instagram in there?
Tanks Green Stuff, yeah.
Okay, cool. I'll put it on the screen so you can send them a message, but definitely give them a follow on Instagram. They have some very, very funny reels and TikToks as well. So if you're not following them on TikTok, you got these big burly men dancing to like little like cutesy songs. It's hilarious. Like every single time I laugh so hard.
Oh, yeah. Shania Twain's one of our favorites.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, well, Shota, thank you again for your expertise on the subject. It's always amazing to talk with you about this stuff, and I always learn so much, so I hope that you guys also enjoyed.
Thanks for having me on. It's been awesome to talk with you on the Soul Chat again, and yeah, if you or anyone else has any questions, don't be afraid to reach out. We're happy to answer them.
Awesome. All right, guys, well, we'll see you in the next video, and if you want to check out our previous soil chats where we talked about mixing your own houseplant soil, we talked about Soil 101, we talked about fertilizer, I'll have that playlist linked down below. All right, we'll see you next time. Bye.